For those of you who don't know me, I'm Veronica Benet-Martinez. I'm a professor in this department, and I'm the organizer of the Research Forum seminars. Welcome to our very first seminar. Before Tony introduces our distinguished speaker and we get started, I just wanted to remind you about I wanted to give you a few reminders. The first one is to please spread the word about the seminars among your colleagues and students. We expect the participation and we expect not the participation only, but the presence of the PhD students. That's a given that we hope and expect them to come and participate. But we also would like to have master students. So professors and students who teach master courses, please find a way to encourage them to come. And the way I do it in my own teaching is I give them credit. So I give them an extra 2 points in their final grade, depending on how many seminars they have attended, okay? So it's very easy to do. They just sign a piece of paper, the sign that they have come. So I wanted to ask you please to do that. The Research Forum seminars are a very important part of the intellectual life of this department. Sometimes it's the only chance we have to all be together across areas, disciplines, and groups. So what I'm saying now, hopefully will sink in. I might say it again in January, but I won't say it every time. And having said that, thank you, those of you who came, and the floor is
All right. Good morning, everyone. I actually wanted to say the same things that Veronica has just said. So now I need to improvise, but I'll try to do it anyway. So again, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce an esteemed member of our community to the first session of the Research Forum that we're going to have here at the department. As you know, Marc joined us a couple of years ago. Is it a couple of years ago? Yeah. Since then, he's been, as I said, an esteemed member of our community, intellectually brilliant, super nice colleague, nice friend, and so on and so forth. It's actually very difficult to introduce Marc because apart from a friend, he's my office mate, and I see him every day. So what I thought I would do is I actually talk about an anecdote. So sorry, Marc, my apologies. So I remember when Marc and I were very young, we went to the ECPR summer school, which was not a very good experience, by the way, in terms of methods, but anyway. And we took my car, a Peugeot 206 at that time, and we drove all the way from Mataró, my hometown, to was it Ljubljana, right? So quite a drive. And I remember particularly because I knew Marc a little bit, but not as much, right? But I remember that we were crossing the Po Valley. You might remember that. And then Marc started talking about Liga Padana and all like the political struggle in the north of Italy and so on from a philosophical point of view, and whether this was just or fair, and all the theoretical questions that I asked at that time. We spent an hour or two talking about this. And then I realized something that I still remember, which is that in academia, apart from like enjoying doing research, apart from like having like meetings all day and struggling to improve the academic life a little bit, it's important to have to be in an academic community that have human beings that are nice, that are intellectually stimulating, and with whom you can talk and have intellectual ideas and conversations, but also coffees, beers, and other things. No? So this Marc encapsulates all this idea, and for me, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce him. Anyway, to the point, Marc will talk about 45 minutes. We asked him what kind of format he wants to follow. We decided that it's only clarifying questions as he talks. So please stick to this rule. And after 45 minutes, we will open the floor for questions, critiques, suggestions, or any other things. Marc, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you, Tony, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Veronica, for organizing all this Forum de Recerca. I know it's a lot of logistics and a lot of work to put together all the emails and the schedule, so thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Tony was talking about the academic community, and he's an old friend, as you can see. And I was recently taught by my friend Nestor Visco on the figure of Professor Albert Calzamiglia. So it's an honor to to be here today, and even more knowing who was Professor Albert Calzabiglia. I am very happy to be the first talking here in this Forum de Recerca. What I'm presenting today is an international and interdisciplinary collaboration. This is something new, as I will show you, and this is something that I never worked before from an academic point of view. Climate change and this kind of this field of research is new to me. But I'm very happy to present this. This is a paper that is already a draft that has already been sent for publication, but this is also the beginning of a collaboration that I think it will go further, because we are now writing some research projects related to this first seminal research. So I think it's worth to share with you these ideas, and I also expect to get some comments from you, or criticisms, or whatever you think about what I'm going to present. So this is a paper. This is a research on the Rawlsian theory of justice and climate change, and I will now present in a few minutes the main argument and the main premises, the main argument, and the conclusion that we reached. But before that, as promised, let me put this in context. It's not working. Don't worry. Don't worry, I can do it from here. It's frozen. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So this is the reality. I have always been working on mostly on territorial conflicts and nationalism. I did my PhD thesis on self-determination, on the right to secede, and I am still working on that. I am currently involved in 2 projects related to this topic. One project from the ministry, the Spanish ministry, on when states allow for independence referendums, a hot topic in Catalan and Spanish politics, and also a project on, also a hot topic today, on courts, on constitutional courts and their role as arbiters in federal countries. So I'm working on these 2 research projects now, and my recent publications are related to this topic. So I have been working during the last years on secessionist conflicts, secessionist demands, independence referendums, and also on federal institutions. So this has been my work until now, and I always think that political theory has to be applied. So that's what this is kind of my method when I work in political theory. I try to read the literature in political philosophy, political theory, and then I try to apply to the context, the situation, some empirical data, or to some reflection on the ground, right? That's what we did with Tony in a joint venture that we published some years ago in the Journal of Politics, relating the Rawlsian theory to survey data. And thanks to Tony and his expertise, we finally published this research that was a collaboration between political theory and political science, I would say. And I continue to do that in other papers, in other publications. I also published, for example, a paper on independence referendums and the plebiscitarian theories of self-determination. And I tried to somehow test the political theory of plebiscitarian secession in the reality. So what's the role of independence referendums in these conflicts? And if the plebiscitarian theories really fit, or the arguments that the authors defend in plebiscitarian theories really fit the reality. So that's my aim, and I try to, or that's my method, and I try to keep this method in this new research. Why I work on climate change? I could now, I don't know, propose some biographical or a very fancy narrative, romantic narrative on my hometown and Montseny Natural Park, or some kind of personal beliefs or whatever. But the reality is like more simple. My friend Joan Vergés organized a conference 1 year ago on John Rawls, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his Theory of Justice, publication of the famous book, A Theory of Justice. And talking with Joan Vergés, somehow I ended up working on the application of the Rawlsian theory of justice to the challenge of climate change. And then I prepared the first draft, and this is also interesting, I think, for the PhD students that I can see in the public. I prepared the first draft. This draft was very, very seminal and very schematic draft. And then I went to the conference. I couldn't attend half of the conference for personal reasons, but in the conference, I came to in touch, or I became friend with Claudio Classer, the other author of this, the co-author of this research, and Claudio discussed some of the points that I was raising in the paper, and we ended up collaborating and redoing the paper in a different way, enriching the paper from his economist point of view, and my political theorist, political scientist point of view. So this research is the result of a collaboration that began in this symposium in Girona 1 year ago. We began working on contractualism, and we found something obvious. Not only Jean Rawls, but all the contractualist theories, as Tocqueville already said many years ago, are somehow indifferent to the future, right? So contractualism, and this is like very theoretical, very philosophical, but it's very easy to understand. Contractualism is a theory on the legitimacy of power that is based on a contract among those alive, among those that are here now and tacitly or explicitly agree to be part of a political community, right? This has an obvious problem. Those that are not born, future generations, do not appear in the picture, right? And famously, as I said, Alexis de Tocqueville already saw that many years ago. And we are facing now a very pressing problem with the future, which is what some authors call, and we take this approach, but we can call it in many different ways, but you all understand what I'm talking about, the problem of sustainability, right? So when climate change and the situation we are now facing as inhabitants of the earth comes into the equation, we face a situation of intergenerational sustainability dilemma, a situation in which we are trying to maximize our benefits, we are trying to maximize our way of life, and we are not taking into account the costs in the future, right? There are many angles of that. There are many ways to see that, but this is the situation that we are facing nowadays. You all know that, and we have seen that this cleavage or this problem or this conflict is even creating some generational movements. Of course, those that are not born, they cannot organize a social movement, but those that are just born, they can organize, and they do organize social movements, claiming not exactly their rights or fighting for not exactly their rights, but for the rights of their future. And their future rights or their future expectations or their legitimate expectations, as the literature puts it, and the legitimate expectations of those that are still not born, right? This sounds like a science fiction or like a TV movie or something like that, but this is very real. This is very real, as you know, right? So we can see on the streets these social movements, and we can see this situation. We all know Greta Thunberg and many other people involved in this movement. The zeitgeist, as we can say, let me use this word, is pointing to this direction, right? Many people describe the situation we are living, the era we are living now, as the Anthropocene, an era which is defined as humans being at the center of the transformation, natural transformation of the planet, right? We are in times of acceleration, as Hartmut Rosa puts it in a very brilliant book that has now been translated by the Herder publishing house here in Catalonia, in times of acceleration. It's not just a matter of speed, it's also a matter of acceleration. It's a function that goes goes up and up. And we are facing, as Toby Ord puts it in his book, The Precipice, we are facing the precipice, right? And that's a situation more or less pressing, more or less urgent or not, depending on the evidence, depending on our beliefs, depending on many questions. But we all know that that's the situation, right? Then we ask ourselves, and I began to ask myself this question, and then in a sort of dialectical way, we discussed this with Claudio Classer, my friend from Italy, from Trento. Well, did Rawls really thought about these questions? The answer is yes and no, right? Rawls is a contractualist political theorist. The Rawlsian theory is a contractualist theory that famously uses this idea, this mental experiment of the veil of ignorance, which we don't know the position that we will have in the society, and then before being part of the society, we agree on the principles of justice, difference principle, and equal liberties, and so on, right? You probably know about the Rawlsian theory. Did Rawls think about the theory of justice? Well, he was well aware. Theory of justice was published in the 70s. There were still no international agreements on climate change and these kind of things that we all know now. But Rawls was very clever on a couple of things. First, he explicitly said, and it's written in his book, he explicitly said that this theory of justice had some limits vis-a-vis nature, for example, right? So there were some limits, some limitations, and these limitations, according to Rawls, depended on a more general theory of nature that he never developed, and it was not his job, right? So he did not mention. But what he did, he mentioned the necessity of taking into account nature, but it was like a limit of the theory, and we don't know exactly what he meant by that. But then we have a second element here that this is what makes interesting Rawls in this case. And I can see some people here that has been working a lot on Rawls, and they already know about this principle. Rawls explicitly told about the principle that when we normally teach Rawls, we don't teach it, or we don't pay attention to this principle, which is the principle of just savings, right? In the Rawlsian theory, so the most important principle is the principle of the difference principle, redistribution among those that are alive, among those that belong to the society, and so on and so forth. But Rawls said, my scheme of cooperation is an eternal scheme of cooperation. So what I am thinking, the way I'm thinking of our society is an eternal cooperation scheme spread out through history until the end of history, until the end of times, right? And a complete difference principle should include a savings principle. Meaning what? Meaning that a certain amount of wealth, a certain amount of redistribution should be saved for the future. But he did not state, he did not specify how many or how much or the exact rate or what was the specification of this savings principle, right? Of course, this principle has become very controversial for two reasons. First, one controversy, and this is a bit tricky to explain now, but one controversy is its connection with the other principles and its coherence with the whole theory. And the other criticism is that Rawls himself, in three different books, offered different justifications of the just savings principle. In the theory of justice, in political liberalism, in theory, in fairness and restatement, he offers a very different defense of this principle that matches in different ways with his theory. He offers at least three different justifications that we identified in his books with Claudio and some secondary literature. The first way that was extremely criticized by the feminist literature was the following one. The individuals that are taking part of this agreement, this veil of ignorance, and then they will be part of the society, are fathers of a family. So they are pater familias, paras a familia, and since they are fathers, they will take care of their sons and daughters. So they intuitively, as fathers, they will take care of their family. So in the agreement of these justice principles, they will save something for the future, right? Rawls even talks about bloodlines, in the sense that this is something part of the deepest understanding of family as a bloodlines, and then society reproduces through the institution of the heteropatriarchal family. Right? This was deeply criticized by many authors, not only because of its obvious implications in terms of gender, but also because it's a bit incoherent with his understanding of the individual behind the veil of ignorance. The individual behind the veil of ignorance is uninteresting, is not related to the other individuals by definition, but then Rawls is telling us that he's a father of a family and takes care of his own family and so on and so forth, which is extremely, extremely controversial in terms of its coherence with the understanding of the liberal disattached, unattached individual, independent, neutral, and not characterized before being part of the society. Right? So Rawls himself became aware of this problem, and in political liberalism, like 20 years later, offered like a different explanation of this principle. He basically said, the things that I said in the 70s were not exactly the best ones. It was not the best definition of this principle. And then the correct definition is that you will think, when you are part of this when you are behind the veil of ignorance, you will think about what previous generations thought and what future generations will think, right? And you will somehow have this rationality to put yourself in the position of the other generation, right? He even improves this argument in Justice as Fairness some years later. And he basically says this should be a principle that refers to this intergenerational dimension, and the individuals will be able to understand what future generations will need. Okay, so we keep this idea. Okay, here there is a problem. There is a problem that has been raised by many authors that is super interesting on the point of entry. Which generation are we talking about? The youngest generation, the older? There are various generations in one point in time in a society. And there is a huge debate on the principles of justice and which one of these generations should be part of this agreement and so on and so forth. I save you, I mean, I don't want now to explain this problem, but there is the entry point problem and so on, which is very, very, very controversial in political theory, in the political philosophy around this topic. But the most interesting part, and I will come back to the justifications, but let me, you already know the justification of this principle, and then let me explain something that's what we use in the paper as a way to criticize Rawls. All these justifications, you can buy the one that you prefer. They all depend on the circumstances of justice, right? So all these considerations make sense if there is a situation of moderate scarcity. If there was total abundance, we would not need a theory of justice. Rawls says, my theory is, following David Hume, my theory is necessary because we live in a world of moderate scarcity. Moderate scarcity meaning what? Meaning that we have resources, but moderate resources, and then we need principles of justice to redistribute the resources. If the resources are too scarce, it's a nightmare, forget about that. If they are too abundant, we don't need a theory of justice. That's the reality. Okay, so natural resources are not so abundant that schemes of cooperation are superfluous, nor are the conditions so harsh that fruitful ventures must inevitably break down. Here there are objective, subjective characteristics. A whole debate on the moderate scarcity thing, following David Hume and many other philosophers. But what we say in the paper, are the circumstances of justice the same that Rawls imagined in the 70s? Are we in a situation of moderate scarcity? Well, there is a whole debate here, but just to the point and very graphic, we can imagine that in maybe not in the worst scenario, in a probable scenario, we are facing a situation of a precipice. We are facing a situation that maybe, I'm going to say maybe, perhaps it resembles more a TV show like The Collapse, L'Effondrement. You probably have seen this TV show, a situation of collapse, of severe scarcity of energy, goods, of trade, and so on, than a situation of moderate scarcity as imagined by John Rawls. In the paper, we say, well, we can discuss this, but let's take a pessimistic view on that. Let's take a pessimistic view on that. What are the circumstances of climate change? The circumstances of justice in climate change. The circumstances of justice differ. They are circumstances of a huge paradox. We are in the lower range of the Rawlsian moderate scarcity. Situation is starting to be harsh, but future generations matter more than ever. And this is a tricky situation, right? As fathers, as independent individuals, as liberal individuals, who cares? As mothers, we really care about future generations' ability to perform or to be citizens as we are in 2-3 generations, right? As we understand being part of a society nowadays, okay? Again, we are taking here like a somehow pessimistic point of view, but it's necessary for the sake of the argument. We need this kind of pushing on this situation. And we are not taking our own words. We are not inventing that. The panel on climate change from the United Nations defines the current situation as exceptional circumstances regarding resources and primary goods, as the Rawlsian jargon would say. So the boiling frog, you all know what is being said. Is that the boiling frog situation already? Yes, no, again, we can discuss this. What do we say? We say, well, the Rawlsian scheme, and that's somehow the conclusion, or that's the argument of our paper. The Rawlsian scheme is good. It's good. It allows us to defend contractualism, think about the duties of the current generation as a pivotal generation in this situation, as Xu says in a very recent book entitled The Pivotal Generation. But it also creates some problems, right? We are thinking about contractualism as a theory of justice as full compliance of this justice. So Rawls was always thinking in terms of an ideal theory meaning full compliance, right? And we ask ourselves if the Rawlsian contractualist scheme is really useful. And we say this ideal theory creates guidance. This ideal theory allows us to compare the theory with the reality. And it also offers us a normative guidance to evaluate how individuals behave in these exceptional circumstances situation. We even argue, and I defended this path, but Claudio was pushing to the next argument I will present. I defended that this ideal theory would still work, perhaps with some small amendments, as some authors have suggested already. For example, the Rawlsian scheme is good, even if the circumstances of justice are changing very fast, if we understand the veil of ignorance, not as a thick veil, as John Rawls defended, but as a thin veil. The individuals behind the veil of ignorance should know about what future generations will suffer very soon. Right? They should have access to the IPCC reports when they take decisions on the rate of savings rate. Okay. I also argue that we could even go back to care or the family as a conservative term in order to foster the idea of taking care of future generations. So we could go back to these ideas and push the Rawlsian theory from an ideal perspective towards this solution, right? However, arguing, and my paper was more or less, or my first idea was more or less like this, but then when we wrote the final paper with Claudio, I became convinced that maybe it's also a good idea to think about a non-ideal approach to the situation, right? And then our paper is proposing a more non-ideal approach than these ideal solutions. Simon Cani has done a great job arguing that the assumption of full compliance is a bit absurd when we talk about climate change policies, right? We all know, we all witness the failure of international treaties on climate change, climate policies at individual level, at collective level, and so on and so forth, right? So we should work on the hypothesis of partial compliance, not full compliance when we theorize these kind of things. And then we argue that at least three aspects should be rethought. First, the length of the generational chain, then balancing the savings principle with the precautionary principle, and finally distinguishing savings from investments, right? This is not only our contribution, because some authors already talked about that, already presented these ideas, but we insist in the idea of the length of the generational chain as a key question. Claudio has already published a paper with some individual evidence on that. So presenting an experimental design in which some individuals know some information on future generations and they represent one generation or the other one, and other individuals have like different information. And at least at individual level in an experimental design, the length of the chain is very short. So the savings rate, the savings decision of these individuals is quite short, right? I don't want to extend, I can explain that later, but Claudio was insisting on the idea that it was perhaps a good idea to propose at a more theoretical level that the length of the future generation is not exactly future generation, it's like the next generation. It's like so the savings rate, it's not a future investment or something that you will you can recover or so on. It's just saving the future generation, right? This is of course debatable. And then a precautionary principle that has been raised by many authors. Are we exactly talking? So Rawls was thinking about future generations in terms of savings and redistribution of present wealth, but are we exactly talking about present wealth, or are we talking about something more rather than negative, positive, negative, something negative in terms of saving the situation or a precaution on maintaining how our society works nowadays? So there would be here a precautionary principle, and this is what we discuss in the paper, the dependence on economic growth, right? So this precautionary principle, Rawls stated that, and we discussed this in the paper, Rawls stated that his theory does not depend on economic growth, but there is a lot of debate on the meaning of growth and economic growth. And we think that at least the precautionary principle should be introduced here, in the sense that taking very seriously the idea that economic growth might stop at some point, at least as we understand economic growth nowadays, right? So there is a precaution here, at least on the understanding of economic growth. And finally, this argument leads us to the third argument, which is how primary goods in the Rawlsian scheme are understood, and how these savings of resources should be at least divided between savings on resources and investments for the future, right? This precautionary principle should be applied to the primary goods and to some specific primary goods that should be granted to the next generation as a sufficient basis for life in the future, right? This is less ambitious than a saving rate, but is probably more realistic facing the exceptional circumstances that we are experiencing nowadays. This is more or less the argument. Do you understand more or less the argument? Yeah, this is more or less the argument. So we conclude that no matter the justification, since the circumstances have changed, the just savings principle should be non-ideal, and at least amended with this different length of the chain precautionary principle, and also savings and investments rethought in terms of what the primary goods really mean. Okay, that's more or less the argument of the paper. We are now working, and this is a more theoretical paper, but we are now working on transforming this paper, not the paper, I mean the project, into a research project, and we already sent a research project to some institutions on how to test these kind of scenarios, and how to test these justice principles in some experimental designs, at least at individual level, just to test the validity of some of these arguments, or some in some specific climate policies, right? We did not succeed to get funding, but at least the paper, I hope it will be published, I don't know. We did not succeed to get funding for these experiments, but we will continue trying, as always, in the academia, to get some funding for this kind of ideas. And there is also room for more debate here. There is a huge literature on the future of, we're discussing this morning, on the future of contractualism, facing the challenge of climate change, right? You know that there are optimistic and pessimistic points of view on the future of contractualism, and to what extent contractualism was depending on the kind of society that we have been living until nowadays. And to what extent contractualism justifies or legitimate, or is able to legitimate to everybody, some of the policies that we will have to implement in the next decades facing this climate change challenge. Well, thank you very much. Comments are more than welcome, and thank you to be here today.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. A lot of food for thought. Comments, questions?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Marc. It was a very interesting presentation. I have a lot of questions. I've tried to sort of categorize them. I realize they kind of go inside of each other. So I'm going to start with the last one, which I think is the biggest one, and try to fit all of the other ones in, and feel free to ignore all of them. It's just, yeah. The big question, the main question that comes to me is, what is the goal? And what do I mean by that? So what is the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Is the goal infinite prosperous humanity? Is it finite prosperous humanity? Is it infinite humanity, whether or not it's prosperous? Is it some other thing that does not necessarily prioritize humanity? Within that, then that brings me to kind of two other things. One that has to do with contractualism, the contract between whom, and you've brought this up a little bit about the kind of which generation is making the agreement behind the veil of ignorance, but especially when you're talking about the chain, which I may not have fully understood. But the contract between whom? Is it current generation members with each other? Is it current generation members with past generations or future? Do non-human entities factor in at all in the contract? And then the other sub part is the assumption of progeny. All of this seems to be based on an assumption of infinite progeny, that every member of humanity that is currently alive should, according to Rawls, should be thinking of future, their sons and their grandsons or whatever. But I know, even in practical matters, a large part of the climate change movement people, I don't know what to call them, have argued for not having children as a response to climate change. So does this completely upend the contractualist nature of the argument to begin with? What about the choice not to procreate? Is that a violation of fairness and therefore a violation of justice as fairness? Is it a solution? And that circles back to the what is the goal? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say that those at home can also ask questions. Marc, do you want to respond or should we collect more?
Yeah. Well, yeah. In this first round, I can respond. Well, thank you for your questions. These are like very deep and very broad questions. I'm sorry because now that I present it, I realized that I was a bit unclear at the beginning on the goal of the paper. The goal was very humble, in the sense that we wanted to grasp on the justifications of the just savings principle facing a change of the circumstances of justice. And we just wanted to evaluate this situation. Then we realized that there was a lot of literature on that. We went reading. Then we ended up with a very modest paper that ends up discussing these potential amendments in a non-ideal way of the Rawlsian understanding of the just savings principle in the intergenerational justice context and so on. So this is like a very academic objective, right? A very academic. I think the general goal of the research, however, is a little bit more ambitious in the sense of really understanding the pressures that our democracy and the way we understand redistributive justice in a liberal democracy, the pressures that this understanding of how we conceive redistribution is facing with the climate change policies and so on. So this is the more general framework. Are these pressures too much? And what I had in mind was this famous recent paper of my colleague Ros Mitiga from Chile that he published 1 year ago, on the future of democracy facing climate change. And if democracy will survive climate change, and if in order to face climate change, we have to choose between democracy or saving humanity. Right, that's more or less. But since this sounds like super ambitious, the less ambitious part is the one that I already described. The contractualism, yeah. As I said, contractual. So the whole contractualist, and there are many experts on that, but the whole contractualist idea is on existing. It's on the present adult individuals. Yeah, of course. But then there is there has always been this tension with what previous generations did, our heritage, and what future generations will do with our political community. But contractualism binds those that are alive, justifying duties because some person that will live in 2230 will face some specific problem. Does this justify sacrificing some rights that we have today? This is very hard to argue in a liberal context. So So before arguing that, you have to be very sure of what you are doing, right? Yeah, on procreation, I don't have an idea here, but yes, of course, there is this refusal of understanding justice towards future generations as a duty nowadays, and there is also a lot of anxiety related to and mental health related to that, in sense of more pressure to the youngest generations, that they really understand that this challenge and they really see that their future is in danger, and then they have different positions on how to act and how to, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark. Very interesting. I think that interdisciplinary research is really needed, inter, whatever, all the disciplines come together among this topic, which is very transversal to all fields of knowledge from my perspective. I have a more reflection for you. What do you think is the bridge between justice, right, and the development project or concept? I mean, you're digging, you're exploring, you're explaining the links between political philosophy, but for me, it's like sort of blind spot with the development project and the economic engine, which is really structured for the issue, for the problematic situation. So when you look at to the Human Development Report of 2020 of the United Nations, Anthropocene, it's the really reality and paradigm that we have to face. But it's not because of the contract of I don't know, in my perspective, it's not because of the principles of savings of John Rawls or of contractualism of John Locke and property link, but it's because of the structure and the roots that humans have been following and building and getting into it. So what is that bridge? Because from the Amartya Sen perspective in the idea of justice, it's not really clear to define what is justice, what is fair, but what is clear to define and to approach is what is unfair. What is unfair for us is more visible, more evident. So from that point, now, philosophical, economic perspective, what is unfair is not only climate change, but how, political elites and economic elites have been engaging each other to work and to become the world in a big farm, in a big factory. And policies such as the Aid Food Program from the United States in the 19th century, which promotes the Green Revolution, first Green Revolution, and then the second Green Revolution, hybrid seeds and so on and so on. So I'm very interested in this topic because, I'm in development, environment, social justice, and there's a lot of topics related to political ecology, actually, more pragmatic way to introduce a sort of virus in the system to make work things in another way, to change the paradigm. The paradoxical perspective of development, which we were trying to, really quick, growing economically, but we're not facing what the development really is. And finally, just to finish what do you think about the ecological blind spot of the development project? Thank you very much, and really appreciate it.
Mark?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, you pointed to many questions, but one deep question here is the debate on growth and the dependence on this specific growth and this specific economic model. And there is a whole field in the literature, at least in the specific literature on distributive justice, and on its dependence on this type economic growth. But I also think that there should be more connections, and I'm ignorant on these connections right now, on the connection between this debate and the political ecology debate, what they call the real GDP, and taking into account all the factors in economic growth and so on. And this is something that we do not tackle in this research, but we should in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. There are a lot of questions, so please try to keep it short. We'll go to Abel and then to Camille at home. Abel.
Thanks. Just a very simple clarification question. Like the logic they presented as this sort of rivalry with the savings and investment principle, it really intrigued me a lot, because it seems like Rawls presented is rather than saving thing is more a self-restraint element, right? I'll try to keep something so that future generations may enjoy it. But the active logic of the saving is that I can save so I can invest. But I did not fully follow the logic of investment that you were presenting in here. So I would like to hear more clarification on that. It's just simple question.
Yeah, we should develop this, but at this point, what I can say is that it's more the logic than the goods that are going to. Okay, the logic is savings, meaning what? Meaning an amount that allows for future citizens to enjoy these primary goods and to have access to these primary goods. That is the core of the Rawlsian theory. Okay, and by this difference, at this moment, we only mean that savings can mean that. And then, of course, there is something more in here, which is this transformation that we are talking about. And the investment would go in this sense, in the sense of saving these primary goods and saving this lifestyle that is part of the theory, but also investing for a transformation of the economic dimension and the meaning of growth and so on, right? That's what we mean in there. And this is still this is just an argument, and we do not develop exactly the way. Of course, it's impossible, but yeah.
Camille from home, your turn. Camille.
Hi, everybody. Well, Abel stole me one of the questions, but I still insist on the fact that the Rawls actually, when he refers to the question of what is a saving, he actually refers to investments as well in the theory of justice. And I think in your paper, you actually quote Rawls on that. So yeah. I actually wanted to ask you what is specific to your argument, since Rawls uses the word saving not in a common sense, like let's say my passive savings in a bank, so he implicitly, even if he doesn't develop a theory of transformation or however you want to call it, there is this active dimension. So savings are related to investments. Not only that they're related, but conceptually there is an overlapping between saving and investment. Another question that I wanted to ask you was about the precautionary principle. Also in the questions you started to speak about this. So it's not really clear to me what it refers to and why this is a problem for Rawls exactly. Like in a talk, you referred to the economic growth issue that is limited, but I'm not sure how this is linked to precautionary principle. And also you referred to something that I would see maybe as more problematic, because you mentioned the precautionary principle in relation to some sort of necessity to, you said, maintain the current order, right? So maybe if you put emphasis on transformation, that is a transformationist agenda, this doesn't square well, maybe, I don't know, it's just a clarification question. Then I say like a general impression. First, I wanted to mention something that I meant saying at the beginning, and like congratulations about this project. And you're very brave, because there are decades, there are libraries, there is an industry on this just savings principle. So you're very brave in dealing with that. And I do think that testing aspects, even if at the micro level, might be enlightening, right? So I really congratulate you on that. But it seems to me from reading your paper that you have two impulses, like one, and I would stress the second one. So one is deferential towards Rawls, like you at points said, oh, the methodology is good, oh, Rawls is great, and he is right. But then you have a more critical agenda, both at the methodological level and at the substantive level. So it seems to me in some sense that you're somehow split between these two impulses. So I would my intuition would be for you to go on the critical side. Let's give an example. With this, I finish the question of methodology. Why should we continue with this Platonic methodology in political theory, right? That is echoed in Rawls at the end of the day. Because you are very critical, you say, look, I'm interested in applied political theory, or I think that circumstances of justice or political circumstances, however you want to call them, are really important. But then you fall back and say, well, Rawls is actually methodologically right and provides orientation and so on. But why would you need a sort of Platonic, very strictly idealizing? Because there are different types of idealization. He idealized in terms of perfect society, in terms of perfection. Why would we need that in terms of methodology? So both at the methodological and the substantive level, we carry on the discussion on this, I'm sure, but I don't want to keep too much space. I would really go more on the critical side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you for your comments. In this last comment, I will reflect on that, because you are totally right. Maybe it's my Christian or Catholic education that was pushing me to reconciliate the goods and the wrongs of in John Rawls' theory. I don't know. Yeah, I will reflect on that. And on the savings and investments, this part is definitely weak, and we should improve this. But as I told to Abel, what we were focusing on is a matter of logic. So when Rawls was talking about that, yeah, he explicitly talks about investments, and we quote Rawls, in fact, but we are not entirely sure that he's exactly talking about the necessity of transforming the whole economy into a different thing in order to keep the same economic growth, or to just survive as a planet and so on. So that's why maybe we shouldn't use these words, but what we mean is that savings changes its meaning facing these circumstances, facing the new circumstances. Savings means a different thing, and the precautionary principle is related to that. So at first I had the first draft in which it was together, it went together. So the precautionary principle is something that in the Rawlsian times, in the 70s, did not exist, and it's the fact that energy resources, natural resources, are scarce, and we will run out of these natural resources very soon. And then we should have a precaution on that. That's what we mean. It's very simple. And that's something we should reflect on. And thank you, Camille, for your comments.
Hello. Now, so we've got 25 minutes left, and I see 4 hands. So let's. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Mark. Obviously, I'm not a political theorist, and I'm not at all. Oh, okay. And I'm not at all, familiar with the literature and the debates and the critiques and the ins and outs of Rawlsian, which I'm sure you can spend your whole education on. But I wonder I think the issue of climate change is very real and easy to, in some sense, understand. And I see a challenge, at least in this talk, is whether is the problem Rawlsian theory, or is it climate change and the issues that we're facing? Because from a decolonial perspective, the issue that the theory seems to be hard to reconcile, right? Because the people who are being most disadvantaged by climate change are the people who are most tied to the land. And probably a lot of them don't live in liberal democracies, which seems that at the end we came to that point of liberal democracy. How do we save liberal democracy or climate change? And so the question is this theory, is it only applicable to the issue of climate change in liberal democracies? And then it seems a little bit hard because climate change is a global issue and it's impacting, people in the present or in the global south who are more tied to the land and of course, future generation, if they could have a future, generation. So I wonder how does this framework and the, nits and bits of it, sort of bring into, and I think this is related to the idea of development, right? So the idea of development, perhaps liberal democracies and, even, modernity, coloniality. So I wonder how your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you, Shahzad. When we were working on the paper, we came aware with one of the fields related to what you are saying. One of the debates is not interpersonal justice, but international justice. And this is a huge issue because, as you said, international treaties are asking a majority of global South countries to sacrifice for the sake of the planet, for the good of the planet, and so on. And they have been suffering for this economic system, and this is unfair, and this should be taken into account. But we don't. I see your point, but we do not tackle this question. We are not discussing this question here. Is the problem Jean Rawls theory problem? Well, in the end, discussing within the framework of this theory is a way to do some academic work on this question, on something that I already knew as an European scholar, right? But yeah, of course, this has a different dimension in the developmental studies and all this. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm super outside my comfort zone, so same there. If my question is a bit silly, please apologies. Somehow it's also connected to what was just said. When you were articulating your argument, to what extent did you consider the connection between the savings principle and the distributional justice aspects of Rawls' work? Because working in environmental justice activism, as I've been doing the last years, I could not help but observing that the same set of drivers that have led us to these exceptional situations have somehow subdued visions of the connection between generations, between people, between entities that are sophisticated beyond what we can capture, say, in some of our perspectives. No, so I specifically is whether you consider this connection relevant, or if at some point no, if you wanted, how would you do it?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question. And yesterday, because of this seminar, I received a paper from a colleague here at UPF, Josep Ferret, and he's precisely discussing the difference principle, which is the redistribution principle within the society, and he's discussing this related to the climate change problem. And reading this paper that I received yesterday, I realized that we should at least include this perspective, or in a future research or in this research. But we should say something about the other Rawlsian principles, because we say almost nothing about that. And there is a clear tension. There is a tension between this, and this could also be exploited in the sense of our argument by saying that the tension between the savings principle and the difference principle was already there in the 70s, it was already there at the beginning, but now is more pressing than ever. Also because of what Shahzad said, because that's exactly the argument. The more you push into the direction of a savings principle and think about the future and so on, the more you realize that the harsh situation that we are experiencing is forcing us to think about the present and about the difference principle now. And yeah, there is a tension in there. Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you, Marc, for your presentation. It was really interesting. I am also outside my comfort zone like you, so sorry if the question is not appropriate. I was listening at you also from a perspective of the feminist critiques to contractualism. And I was thinking that as the exclusion of women from classical contractualism left not only women, but also all the private sphere of life and care work out of the political discussions and also out of the public debate, which is something that we are still suffering. I was thinking that maybe there's a parallel in relation to this issue where the exclusion of children from contract, the children and young people and teenagers or the younger generations, also the exclusion of children for from the contract, maybe also left future as a topic out of the political discussion and out of the discussions about justice. And I think it also relates to what Shahzad was saying about who has maybe some interest in protecting the planet, maybe the future generations, but also people that is suffering more from climate change. So that there's something between, I think that there's a relation between who is excluded from the contract and what are the topics that we are debating and that are central for theories of justice. And I thought that it was really interesting to look at this from the perspective of children and youth. I know that there are some critiques to this contractualism from a feminist perspective, from anti-racist perspective, but I've been wondering why there's no like theory that is specifically focusing on why children and younger generations are not part of this contract, and maybe climate change might be thought as a consequence of that. So maybe climate change is a consequence of not taking into account children and younger generations in theories of justice. And it was just an idea that I was having when I was listening to you, and I wanted to know your opinion on that.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. There is a literature on that, and there are some countries that are already doing some experiences like innovative democracy and so on, including representatives in legislative bodies, for example, legislative chambers, representatives of children, and representatives of future generations. So in some specific regions, they include now commissions of people randomly selected that represent those that are still not born to review, at least review the laws in sense of related to this climate thing, obviously. Yeah? And also and related on the children, I also read something, but I should read more on these young generations democracy experiences and so on, which is also interesting. But I agree with you that this is probably the result. There is a historical argument here that we could use in the papers as well. There is a historical argument on the failure of contractualism by excluding, and women show that, and the feminist literature writes that, but this could also be the result of a historical exclusion of the youngest generations. And this is a powerful argument, I think. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marc, for a very interesting presentation. I think I've learned a lot. This is not my expertise. And thank you for that. So my question relates to Maria's question, first question, and then secondly, clarifying question. So I was wondering if Rawls said something about it. If not, what are your thoughts about involving future generation or the current, like children, you know, like small children in the political decision making, and also in deconstructing what justice is, because of course they are the affected parts, right? So there's this movement within deliberative democracy, and you have just mentioned it, which basically says that whatever, especially in topics like climate change, because the parties which are affected are future generations or children, they have to be on the table discussing what kind of decisions needs to be taken. So I wonder if Rawls did
did say something about it. Otherwise, what are your opinion about it? I know that there are like democratic innovations happening now around the world, and which you have said, they involve children and so on. It has its pros and cons, sorry. And what are your thoughts about it? So that my second question is more clarifying. I didn't understand, but I would be super interested in understanding what you meant by length of the generational chain, which kind of is a key part of your argument, right? It's a key part of your contribution of interpreting Rawls' argument. So what did you mean? I didn't really catch that. Did you mean that like being interested in the kind of a first future generations interests, and the length is more like second, third, incorporating several, or what do you mean there?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lala. Yeah, to my knowledge, and you can contradict me, to my knowledge, Rawls did not devote much attention on the children representation in the democracy and so on. I'm a bit skeptic on that for the reason that for the justification reason, because it's it's deeply rooted in our culture. This justification, this understanding of the liberal individual as free, rational, and capable of reasonability and so on. This is so deep in our culture, at least in the Western culture, sorry, that we, how do we justify to ourselves including this perspective? One potential avenue is as member of a family. But this potential avenue then opens some questions on family models, on family, on the justification of the family and so on, right? So I'm a bit skeptic because of the justification of this representation. I think that they have the capacity and rationality to participate, but I do not think that our philosophical approach to our institutions it's open to this, to understanding this capacity and to including this capacity. I'm a bit skeptic on how it would work in how it works in the reality. On the length of the chain is related to this idea on the pivotal generation, right? So the chain of generations, or the intergenerational definition in the 70s or the 60s and 70s and before that was that one generation comes after another, and right, and future will come and so on, and that's how life is. And we are in a context of economic growth, we are in a context of expansion, we are in a context of redistribution, and we can even interpret the difference principle as a trickle-down principle, right? So those that are richer get richer, and those that are poorer get also richer because of this increase in wealth in the size of the pie, right? The argument is that when we face climate change, there is a kind of transformation of the conception of time. Because time is time now as we thought it would be 40 years ago regarding the intergenerational thing. No, because we do know that at some point, the next or the following one, the next generation or the following one or the other one will face this precipice. And again, we are working from this premise of the precipice and so on in our paper, but for the sake of the argument, we try to make it a bit, not catastrophe, but a bit pessimistic in the sense that there is a change there in terms of the circumstances of justice, the scarcity, the moderate scarcity, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the change in the length of the intergenerational future. Can we imagine now the intergenerational future as it was imagined in the European context of the post-war liberal democracies? I don't think so. I don't think so, because we know what we know. We have the evidence from the IPCC panels.
Thank you, Mark. We've got 11 minutes left, and I still have 3 hands. So if you can keep it very short.
Hello, thanks. I'm doing a PhD here in applied political theory in climate change activism, actually with Camille. And so first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. As a political theorist from Frankfurt, I found it really inspiring and fruitful to talk about Rawls from a new perspective. So just one comment on Rawls and climate change. I think there are several issues we could talk about. One is basically that Rawls, in the majority of his argumentation, focuses on one society and debates within one society. And when we talk about justice these days, we obviously talk a lot about intergenerational justice. So not just for future generations, but also justice all around the world. And from this perspective, there are a lot of angles you could criticize Rawls, but this doesn't mean that you can still focus on some aspects and look how they can be applied to climate change. I just have basically 2 comments which may be helpful, or I don't know if you know them, but one thing I was thinking about is this argument of fathers will automatically save something for their sons. If we leave the gender debate aside, this is something I was thinking about a lot, because you could think that people would try to protect the planet just for the sake of their own children. And we can see organizations gathering together like Parents for Future or Grandparents for Future even, but you can still see a lot of people who don't do the direct connection. I think this is because climate change is just too abstract. Like, it's not about saving some goods for later. It's like most of the people don't draw the connection directly. And the second thing is, because we were talking about, or you were talking about a lot about contractualism, I don't know if you know that Extinction Rebellion actually declares themselves to withdraw from the concept. So they say because the government is not protecting their people anymore, their citizens anymore in light of climate change, they have in their official handbook written a statement saying we are withdrawing from the concept of contractualism, which I found from a philosophical perspective really interesting, and I think that's something that could be looked into, because they are dealing a lot with this concept and saying we don't feel represented here anymore. We want our voice back and we want to make our own decisions. They're also demanding a citizen assembly, which should be politically binding for legislation. Yeah, those are my 2 points.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to collapse the last 2 interventions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just to
Yeah.
comment. Thank you, Gina. Yeah, thank you, Gina, for your comments. I didn't know about that, and I take note and I will check it. Thank you.
Next.
Thank you. My question is actually quite similar to Gina's first comment, but I want to see your thoughts on that. First of all, thank you, Mark, for this presentation. But taking into account the fact that you're trying to work within a Rawlsian framework, I was wondering if you are planning to discuss the fact that that's what Gina said, that Rawls' view of society is of society as a sort of closed institutional system. And I think that's quite interesting for this debate, because Rawls, in The Law of Peoples, argued that because of this conception of society, he argued that justice, at least justice in a strong sense, is a domestic matter. But climate change is not a domestic matter, well, as we of course all know. So I was wondering if you have given or are planning to give any thought to in your discussion to this like interpretative problem within the Rawlsian framework. Is it useful to think within a Rawlsian framework on this topic, taking into account the fact that Rawls assumed a statist view on questions of global justice and refused the cosmopolitan readings of his theory of justice?
Thank you, Alejandro, for your comment.
Thank you. Let's go to Alina, the last one that we have.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm joining my colleagues who feel a bit uncomfortable or outside our comfort zone in discussing about Rawls theory. But a comment I wanted to, or a question I wanted to raise is linked to your, somehow, if I understand well, your claim that nowadays there is more awareness about the impact of climate change on future generations, somehow as an extension to this idea that because past generations have been less aware about impacts that activities had on future generations, we are where we are, right? And I was wondering if this claim that there's more awareness nowadays is linked to a policy-making type of awareness, or it's a societal type of awareness you're noticing, and whether this level is supposed to play any role in your framework in terms of how this problem can be dealt with. Thank you.
All right. Is there any last super fast comment question? No? Two chats. Well, they could raise their hand, or if not, I'm going to avoid them. Anyway, Marc, you have 10 seconds to respond. No, Marc.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, your comments is very interesting, but this also makes so we are totally aware of this Rawlsian problem of justice being a domestic issue, and this has created a whole debate on the international justice and climate change and so on. But this also makes things easier in the sense that then we can focus on, so there is this problem, then we can focus on the connection between the savings principle and the difference principle and so on. We can discuss this at domestic level, and then we can tackle this. There are obviously connection in between these levels, as it was said before, but this also allows for a more controlled analysis of the principles and how the principles work in redistribution within the society, the given domestic society. And thank you, Alina, of this awareness thing. Yeah, we do not provide much support on that, so it's something we take for granted as a way to present our argument. This change in the circumstances of justice is justified in terms of societal perception of things, which is not very scientific, I assume, I accept, I admit, but we quote this panel, climate panel and so on, just to and some philosophers and some political scientists, just to reinforce the idea or to support the idea that the change in the circumstance, in the moderate scarcity, or how we perceive the situation, it's real, and this change exists, and it has a subjective but also a material factual reality. We can measure the temperature of the globe. We can measure the changes in how much natural resources are left, and we can measure this, and this is a material thing. But there is also the most interesting thing to us. It's a subjective understanding of the metaphysical understanding of this. What's our place in the earth? What's how we understand future, and how we are witnessing, as Gina said, many citizens that are starting to feel that this is not only real, that this is a different existence in the world, in the sense that we never thought about future like that. That's more or less that's our point. We do not provide a survey or I don't know, numbers on that. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, now, yeah. All right, thank you very much, Marc. Two final remarks, very fast. The first one, we'll strongly encourage you to start to continue coming to the research forum. Please do come along. Second one, let me join me in congratulating and in thanking Marc for this lovely presentation. And yeah, have a nice day.